Dave, what has always struck me as astonishing is the tremendous number of really smart people who are arrayed all along this vast spectrum of what consciousness really is, from people who say that it doesn't exist, it's a mirage, you should eliminate it, to those who say that it's the only thing that exists. Not only is it fundamental, but everything else is a mirage, and then everything in between. Why is that the case, and is that continuing?
Well, consciousness is about the most puzzling phenomenon in nature, and something has to give to accommodate it in our picture of the physical world. It's a bump in the rug, and you can move the bump here, and you can move the bump there, but there's always going to be some discomfort in your view. So you've got the eliminativists who say there's no such thing as consciousness. Then you've got the reductionists who say consciousness is real, but we can reduce it and explain it in terms of a brain process. You've got the dualists who say that there's the brain and there's consciousness, and these are two different things. Right. Then you've got the idealists or the panpsychists who say actually consciousness underlies the whole physical world.
And even there you have a difference, because you have those who say consciousness is part of the physical world, equal at a fundamental level with the laws of physics. And then those strong idealists who say that consciousness is the only thing and that somehow the material world is a product of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's the kind of idealism that says the whole physical world is just in the mind of the observer, or it's some big dream I'm having, or I'm somehow constituting the whole physical world. And that's somehow putting humans at the very center of the universe. There's an idea which is somewhat more sort of respectful of physics and so on, that says, actually, it's not just us. Yeah. There's consciousness right at the ground level of the physical world, and quarks and electrons are kind of little phenomenon of consciousness, little conscious agents in their own right. And these are two different ways of going on that extreme of the spectrum.
Yeah, and then on the physical side, you have those who would say that you can explain consciousness, we don't know how to do it yet, in terms of traditional neuroscience, which operates at the level of the neuron, maybe neuron circuits, and those who say that you have to dig into the quantum physics or resonances and all sorts of very complex physical, but still keeping it within the physical world. Yeah. But those are radically different points of view. I mean, so you have this in each area. Are you seeing any kinds of convergence, or are you seeing more divergence?
It is a field which by its nature is letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and they're blooming in different directions. So on the materialist side of the story, we have the computationalists who say it's all about computation, basically. We've got let's call them the biologicalists who say it's all about something about the neural wetware. And then you've got the quantum mechanics theorists who think it's all some fundamentally quantum phenomenon. And, all of these views are getting uptake in different ways.
Yeah, and do you see them as ever working together, as nesting within each other, or is each theory very egocentric in its own light, and it tries to explain it totally on its own?
I mean, I think there's certainly prospects for convergence there. You might believe it's really the computation that fundamentally does the work in giving you consciousness. It's structures of information, for example, and to take one leading current idea. It's the information structures that get integrated that gives you consciousness. But at the same time, you might think, that's got to be grounded in certain specific biological wetware in a human brain, and that biological wetware is going to be a key part of the story. And maybe there's some way to work quantum mechanics in there, but I haven't quite figured that out yet.
And in that model, you do not need a panpsychic approach.
What's interesting, there are people, Giulio Tononi, for example, has put forward the integrated information theory of consciousness, which is really a leading contender right now. And his view is that consciousness is the integration of information. In the human brain, there's a huge amount of information being integrated all the time, and therefore a very high degree of consciousness. But in simpler systems, a dog, a mouse, a fly, a computer, there's still some integration of information. So on his theory, there's some little bit of consciousness, even at the fundamental level of nature. A photon, an electron integrates a few little bits of information. On his view, there'll be a little bit of consciousness there. So interestingly, even this computationalist theory ends up going in the direction of panpsychism.
The difference being, though, that in that case, the proto-consciousness in the wherever you find it is derivative. It's not fundamental.
Yeah,
sounds that way.
You should talk to Tononi about this. But when I talk to him, he says things like consciousness is fundamental integrated information is also fundamental. And it's as if there's a fundamental law of nature. Where there's integrated information, there's consciousness. And he's putting that forward as his fundamental postulate of consciousness.
Correct. But do you have integrated information in an electron?
I think you have a very small amount of integrated information. He has a measure of integrated information called phi. Yeah. And the idea is high phi, a lot of consciousness. Electrons are low phi. There's still some phi, there's some information there. And on his view, I think, a modicum, let's say, of consciousness.
And when you look at panpsychism, and I've been impressed of a growing number of people, and again, I don't know if that's because I have certain friends or something but it does seem to be a growing number of people who either fully endorse it themselves or respect it enough to say that we must consider it because everything else is not working. Mm-hmm. Is this a trend, or is it just a few people who are making a lot of noise?
I'd say it's a trend. I mean, the jury is still out on whether it's flavor of the month, flavor of the year, flavor of the decade, so to speak, whether it's something that's really going somewhere. I mean, it's interesting we're getting convergence from people coming from very different directions. Some people very much on the pure philosophy side have grown to take it very seriously. But then we've got neuroscientists like Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi who are taking it seriously, and people coming from physics like Roger Penrose who are taking it seriously. So that's at least a convergence. Now that said, I think there are still some pretty serious problems for the panpsychist view. How is it that these little bits of consciousness at the bottom level, photons or electrons in my brain, every one of them a little conscious subject on the panpsychist view, how do they all add up to my conscious experience? How do you put together the billions of little conscious agents in my brain and get the kind of familiar consciousness that we know and love? That's what people call the combination problem for panpsychism, and it's an awfully hard problem. It's an aspect of the original hard problem of consciousness. And there have been some panpsychists putting forward some creative ideas about this, but I'd say that no one has nailed it yet. If we can't solve that problem, then panpsychism has a seriously uphill battle.